Yes, and in English.
Good evening or good morning, everyone, depending on the part of the world where you are joining us from. Thank you so much for taking interest in our event and for taking the time to participate. This roundtable is part of the international conference Horizons of Engagement, Eternalizing Bourdieu, organized by the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory of Belgrade, Serbia, the Center for Advanced Studies of the University of Rijeka, Croatia, the École Normale Supérieure of Paris, France, and the French Institute in Serbia. We have organized this conference on the occasion of the 90th anniversary of the birth of one of the world's leading sociologists, Pierre Bourdieu, born in 1930 and died in 2002. The greatest indicator of the scope of Bourdieu's influence is the fact that he has become the most cited sociologist ahead of Emil Durkheim and the world's second most cited author in social sciences and the humanities after Michel Foucault and ahead of Jacques Derrida. As Loic Vacan pointed out, Bourdieu became a name for a collective research endeavor that transcends the borders of state and disciplines. As part of this discussion, we will address with our distinguished guests the subject of Bourdieu and politics. Politics broadly constructed, of course. We will evoke in particular Pierre Bourdieu's involvement in public affairs during the 1990s, while taking into account the concept of the collective intellectual that Bourdieu introduced into social sciences by giving it a specific meaning. I would now like to take this opportunity to thank and introduce our guests. Gisèle Sapiro is a research director at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS, and director of studies at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, EHESS. She's a specialist in the sociology of intellectuals, literature, and translation. This year, she published the Bourdieu International Dictionary, a work of 6 years that she conducted and that is sure to become a classic and a major contribution to the understanding of Bourdieu's oeuvre for generations to come. Frederick Lebaron is a professor of sociology at the École Normale Supérieure Paris-Saclay, where he heads the social sciences department. He was president of French Sociology Association between 2015 and 2017. His research focuses on economic policies, their genesis and consequences, global social dynamics, and transformations in the definition on the role of intellectuals. Frederick Lebaron is one of the authors of the book, The December of French Intellectuals, where one can find very useful references to Pierre Bourdieu's involvement in the social movement in France in 1995. Franck Poupeau is director of research at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS. Between 2012 and 2017, he was director of the Joint International Research Unit, Interdisciplinary and Global Environmental Studies, based at the University of Arizona. His research focuses on urban inequalities and water policies in South America and the USA. And Philip Golub is professor of political science, political philosophy, and international relations at the American University of Paris, AUP. His research focuses on the state, globalization, and modern and contemporary international imperial history. He's author of Power, Profit, and Prestige, a history of American imperial expansion. He's also an honorary member of our institute's International Academic Committee. In 1999, with Pierre Bourdieu, he signed a petition against the bombing of Serbia. And last but not least, your hosts. Zona and I are research fellows at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory of Belgrade and organizers of this conference with Milan Urošević. Zona is finishing her PhD in philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure Paris, and mine was done as a co-direction between Paris 8 University and the University of Belgrade. Actually, we have prepared 3 questions per guest, and final 4th one, the same for all. And after this, we will leave half an hour for questions from the audience. And please write in the chat if you would like to ask a question. We will be taking questions actually in both English and French. I wanted to start with Gisèle Sapiro.
Just before you continue, to reassure you, it seems that people are now connecting on the live stream on YouTube, so the number is growing there.
Professor Sapiro, you recently directed an impressive collective work, Bourdieu International Dictionary, which is already the best-selling encyclopedia and dictionary of sociology and ethnology on Amazon. It contains nearly 600 entries, a team of 126 authors from 20 countries, and bring together specialists of Pierre Bourdieu, among them sociologists, political scientists, philosophers, historians, anthropologists, and others. The entries cover the concepts, objects of research, methods, disciplines, and the intellectual currents with which Bourdieu interacted, as well as his favorite authors and his relationships with his peers, his works, the journals, association he founded, editions, significant events such as the Algerian War, May 1968, the strikes of 1995, as well as the main countries in which his work was received, from the USA to Japan. I would like to ask you, what was the motivation behind this immense 6-year-old project?
Yeah, thanks first for inviting me to take part in this roundtable, and I'm very happy to discuss this work with my colleagues and about more broadly Bourdieuan politics. So it was the editor I was working with for my series at CNRS Edition, who had first the idea and who commissioned the dictionary, because CNRS Edition had a series of dictionaries, and they wanted to open it to the social sciences. It was mainly literature, and they wanted to start with Bourdieu. And actually, I immediately accepted because I had an experience with the dictionaries. I was part of the team of the Dictionnaire des Intellectuels Français long ago, and the Métron also. And also because I had the international Bourdieu network. I was connected with this network. And so we agreed from the start with the editor that it should not be only about concepts, but also about his life, the thinkers he discussed with, and the places where he published, including newspapers like Le Monde, Libération. And I must say that we had much fun with the editorial board to establish the list of entries. And so Franck Poupeau was part of the editorial board with Julien Duval, François Denord, Johan Elbron, and Mathieu Schkorn, and Frederick Lebaron was part of the scientific committee, and they all contributed a lot of entries also. And Hélène Seller was the editorial coordinator. So first, the dictionary had 3 objectives. First, of course, there was a didactic, pedagogic one. It is an introduction to Bourdieu's thought for students, but also for researchers who are less familiar with his thought, and also for those who are more familiar, because it helps deepen our understanding of his work. And I myself must say I learned a lot from reading the articles. So for instance, you can find not only the more specific concept of Bourdieu's theory, such as field, habitus, cultural capital, but also concepts that he uses or redefines, such as belief, interest, disinterestedness, hysteresis, misrecognition, or nomos. and also concepts he discusses or rejects, such as public opinion or norms. You can also find classical authors he referred to, philosophers such as Pascal, Hume, Kant, Rousseau, or Kripke, sociologists such as Durkheim, Elias, Goffman, Merton, and Max Weber, or anthropologists like Mauss and Lévi-Strauss. But it's not at all a purely academic approach aimed at mummifying Bourdieu's thought. And this brings me to the second objective. The dictionary is meant to serve the research program elaborated by Bourdieu and continued all around the world. It is a tool for a researcher willing to carry on this theoretical and empirical program in a dynamic way. It can help them navigate easily in his work, find references, connect concepts and objects with broader theoretical and methodological issues in the social sciences. For instance, why should we be suspicious about functionalist explanation? What does it mean to have a relational approach? Which empirical works were undertaken on the fields of cultural production and on the issue of autonomy beyond Bourdieu, and so on. And this leads us to the third objective. This dictionary is conceived of as a contribution to the epistemology and history of the social and human sciences, since Bourdieu has discussed the most important paradigms and theories of his time, such as Marxism, structuralism, rational choice theory, and he contributed himself to develop a social history of the social and human sciences, which should not be purely conceptual and focused on key thinkers, though we did, of course, include figures like Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, but it should be also anchored in the social world and connected to social agents and institutions. For instance, we included the institutions he was trained in, like the École Normale Supérieure, and the ones he worked in, like the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and the Collège de France, which he himself included in his own research on higher education and the academic field. So we could at once deal with Bourdieu in these institutions and the way he tackled these institutions in his research. Of course, we included also the journals and series he edited, and as you mentioned, the main countries of reception of his work, that we have 28 entries, and you can observe the different receptions of Bourdieu. For instance, in the UK, it was first sociology of education. In Italy and Brazil, it was first his sociology of culture and of symbolic power. And when Distinction was translated in 1984 in English, it helped create the sociology of culture as a sociological domain in the United States, where it did not exist before. So, for instance, the American Sociological Association section on sociology of culture was created in 1986 as a result of the reception of Distinction in the US. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gisèle, very much. It's quite interesting to introduce the conference, the roundtable this way, because all of you participated in a way in this endeavor, and all of you have a lot to say, I'm sure, about the role of intellectuals in your roles, the way you see it today. I would now ask the second question, the following question to Philippe Golub. So Philippe, according to Pierre Bourdieu, it is easy for a sociologist to cease to be an adherent of certain parties, unions, associations, but it's difficult to refuse adherence or some sort of semi-social conscience that is at the heart of this thinking. Moreover, the history of sociology is a history of commitment, contrary to what the idea of axiological neutrality suggests, which artificially separates the scientific work that produces scholarship from the commitment that consists in bringing the scholarship into the public sphere. So Gisèle Sapiro was talking about this as well in a recent interview, where she emphasized that Pierre Bourdieu's sociology was everything but neutral. What do you think is the difference between scientific objectivity that was so important to Pierre Bourdieu and Weberian axiological neutrality on the other side?
Thank you very much for that question. Greetings to all. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate in this web seminar and in this conversation. I think to begin answering that, let me start with an anecdote to frame the issue. Many years ago, at the end of the 1990s, I was traveling to an international conference in Asia with a prominent colleague from the French Academy, who at some point in our rather long trip moved our very friendly discussion to the fraught question, the difficult question of Bourdieu's recent political engagement. And this colleague expressed very deep dismay over Bourdieu's choice to speak out and act out, not only to speak out, but to act out on the public stage about sharply contested political and social questions of the moment. In his view, by doing that, by engaging in the way in which he had, Bourdieu would have blurred the barrier between scientific analysis and activism and broken with the detachment, the axiological neutrality required of the, or supposedly required of the scientific enterprise. To borrow or to distort the title of a classical book on the history of science, Bourdieu would have in some way fallen off the edge of objectivity into the purgatory of subjectivity, the purgatory of mere opinion, and thereby somehow tainted, that was his feeling, that he had somehow tainted and diminished his body of scientific work, his oeuvre. The problem of the edge of objectivity in the social sciences is a problem that has been discussed since the beginning of the social sciences. In the hard sciences, the problem is pretty well defined. The edge is well defined. If you leave out some of the spookier parts of quantum physics, which I'm not actually competent to actually deal with. In the natural sciences, in the hard sciences, what's called the hard sciences, you have a permanent object, at least as far as human lifespans are concerned, an external object to the observer, which allows for the reproducibility and the falsifiability of experiments, and which allows you also, therefore, to have knowledge of a cumulative nature. General relativity supplants Newtonian mechanics without making Newtonian mechanics useless. Quite to the contrary, we couldn't live actually day to day in the quantum world. Even though we do live in the quantum world, we don't live every day in the quantum world, but we do live very well in the world of Newtonian mechanics. So the problem is, where's the edge, and how does that edge lead in the case of Bourdieu, I think, and his political engagement and other political engagements of scientists, of social scientists. How does this lead to the question of objectivity and engagement in the social sciences? Bourdieu is very prolific on this question. You'll find references to the problem of objectivity, the question of objectivity throughout his work, in his courses at the Collège de France and in most of his books. The business of science is to bring to light phenomena that are not accessible through simple intuition or immediate perception, to discover, in the sense of uncovering, of taking the cover off of, the logics of social being and of social action, logics that remain hidden for most in the labyrinthine structures, the unconscious, let's call it that, the unconscious structure generated by the fields of social order and social structure. But that being said, the knowing subject, as Bourdieu himself pointed out, I think, very strongly and clearly, the knowing subject cannot achieve the objectivism of the distant gaze, and I'm citing him on this, of the distant gaze of an observer who remains as remote from himself as from his object. Okay? The observer observes, writes, and speaks from a specific location in space-time, in social space-time, emitting judgments and interpretations that can modify the facts on which they are passed. So Marx is a very good example of that, and that enter into the actual constitution or production of the social world. In any case, one cannot, as Bourdieu emphasizes, I think very powerfully, and I'm citing him again, build a science on something as poor and disappointing as Weberian ethical neutrality. Even though, Bourdieu is very much influenced by Weber and uses Weber and mobilizes Weber in all kinds of ways, notably in the field of symbolic understandings and symbolic action. On that particular point, he's very far apart from Weberian efforts at construction of axiological neutrality. Inevitably, since the social world is one of subjectivities, of intersubjectivities, and those intersubjectivities require a different method of analysis than those that are required of the natural sciences. So from there to engagement in the public sphere, there's still a step, and the action in this public sphere, engagement in the public sphere, is distinct from the epistemological questions and methodological problems of the social sciences. But the scientist is also inevitably a citizen. And in this case, in the case of Bourdieu, a citizen with an extraordinarily solid and powerful theoretical toolbox on which to base his judgments. Like everyone else, the scientist, the observer, the knowing observer, all of us, we are swept up in historical events. We are swept up in historical currents. We are swept up in the struggles and the ethical dilemmas of the present. And in that sense, the scientist, the social scientist, cannot avoid the inescapable question of moral choice and ethics in politics, the choice to act or not to act, the choice to speak out in the public sphere or not to speak out in the public sphere. And indeed, it's precisely because the knowing subject has a slightly, and I emphasize slightly, has a slightly higher degree of freedom than most people, because the social scientist can pierce through some of the veils of material and symbolic domination. Because of that, and because the social scientist has a claim to knowledge and hence to voice, that he, she, they can and sometimes, I think, must engage, okay? Most people are circumscribed. C. Wright Mills points this out, are circumscribed in their everyday lives, in the everyday world, by everything, the surroundings in which they are, by the social structures in which they live. The social scientist doesn't govern, doesn't have more direct power than these ordinary people, as C. Wright Mills calls them, but at least she can understand the force fields, make apparent the force fields that shape people's lives and lift the veils, the most important of which is the illusion of spontaneous freedom, that make power and domination misrecognizable to most people. To conclude on this, I think that, given that Bourdieu's oeuvre, his whole oeuvre deals with the question of domination, symbolic and material, there's an important point at which the work of the scientist is a work actually of giving agents the ability to become self-determining actors. There's a very nice quote of his, which I use and I like, which is this: there is, in any case, he writes, this is my translation, affinity from one of his courses, affinity between the position of the dominated and the scientific position. Once the scientific truth is produced, the dominated in a space, in a field, hear it better and use it immediately, distorting it, tampering with it, so that it expresses them more completely. The dominated, in other words, are then in a better position to become the self-determining actors I was just talking about. And I think the question of objectivity falls within these cracks.
Thank you, Philip. Just a little summary of what you were saying towards the end. It seems like what you're saying is that those who can must engage, and therefore those who can't will be better enabled to as well. And this is what we're trying eventually with this roundtable to discuss and to realize not only that, but as well, what is it, with probably the following question for Franck Poupeau, and further to develop this idea that made Bourdieu engage. Was it maybe the ethnological work in Algeria? Was it in the 90s when he started writing his first pamphlets? So from academic neutrality towards engagement. So my following question is thus for Franck Poupeau. You have collected and edited Pierre Bourdieu's public interventions in a book entitled Political Interventions, Social Science and Political Action. And this publication includes all of Pierre Bourdieu's interventions between 1961 and 2001. Quite an impressive period to look at. It therefore allows us to follow directly and in a very interesting manner his evolution in relation to these topics, to the topics that interested him and on which he took a position from the age of 31. Would you try and describe for us this evolution, perhaps by adding some nuances in the difference between the early and the late Bourdieu, as well as the regularities that characterized him during this 40-year period?
Well, thanks for the invitation. There are many connection problems during your question, but as you had sent it to me before, I will try to respond it briefly. One of the key points of interventions that I elaborated in 2000 with Thierry Discipolo from Agone was to show the continuity of Bourdieu's commitment against a very common and political vision of a rupture in its trajectory since 1995 and since the French social movement against the Juppé reform. So it was quite easy to find many texts about his early commitments. For example, in Algeria, he published very early in Les Temps Modernes or in Esprit, which were very big and important visible journals at that time and not academic journals. As one more thing to precise, as I'm currently editing another work from Bourdieu, which is Travail et Travailleurs en Algérie, which was originally published in 1963, and we'll publish it in Raison d'Agir Edition by the beginning of January. Is I realized that the initial questions of Bourdieu in Algeria were very political. And it was not only about colonization, but also about the conditions of access to politics, to politicization, to revolutionary positions. And these questions, he went on working on them in texts such as L'opinion publique n'existe pas, 10 years after, in La Distinction, and in the end of his career in Language and Symbolic Power, for example. About Travail et Travailleurs en Algérie, Johan Albron has shown recently in an article on French sociology that this Algerian period, and especially this first book, had been the matrix of his ulterior sociological research, not only on the political field of the social conditions of access to politics, but also on his conception, which is very political, of collective work in social sciences and of empirical research. And so it's not only Bourdieu's political commitments that we have tried to restitute, even if the political interventions were the core of the book, but also to show how it has influenced his way of practicing sociology from the beginning to the end. Well, that's it. I won't be long about it. It will be complicated to make a synthesis of all the steps and maybe some of the difference of the perceptions if we go beyond the political struggles in the end of Bourdieu's career, and if we go beyond the attempts of delegitimizing his political interventions, is that also any intervention is contextualized, and sometimes they are more visible, not only because of the scientific or political capital of the people that initiate it, but also because of the conditions of the intellectual field and political field in front of him. So, but that's another point that we will talk about, I suppose, in the end of the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franck Poupeau. I would like to continue with Frederick Lebaron. Frederick Lebaron, you are one of the authors of the book, The December of French Intellectuals. This book challenges dominant interpretations which were given by the media and the dominant intellectuals of the interventions of intellectuals, among them Pierre Bourdieu, of course, during the social movement against the devastation of the social security system in November and December of 1995. This was possibly the largest social movement since May 1968. At that time, you worked at the Centre de Sociologie de l'Éducation et de la Culture, created by Bourdieu after May 68. Is this perhaps the moment when he really begins to deeply put into question and upset what is called in France the pensée unique, single-mindedness in English? Actually, we find the center-left intellectual review Esprit denouncing Pierre Bourdieu as a left-wing populist, leftist extremist, and even a crypto-Lepenist. Could you please contextualize here Pierre Bourdieu's commitment against the Plan Juppé and the reasons behind why he became the intellectual reference for the social movement as a whole, but at the same time so stigmatized in the mainstream media?
Thanks. I will try, but first, thanks for the kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be live on YouTube with, I think, 25 people following, a bit less than Shakira. In 1995, Bourdieu was already present actually in the public space since many years, in a sense since he published about Algeria, as Franck Poupeau just showed. But it was especially the case after the success of La Misère du Monde, The Weight of the World, in 1993. This scientific collective book corresponds to an evolution of his commitment to the left, in a sense, and closer to more radical social movements, to put it rapidly. After his, what I would call his Rocard years, Rocard is the name of a French socialist modernist prime minister whom Bourdieu supported strongly. Bourdieu had been heavily disappointed by the French center-left government between 88 and 93, and especially in the sectors of education and social policy. He's one of the first intellectuals, actually, who, in France at least, points out and criticizes what he calls a retreat of the left hand of the state. That is the welfare state, the social state, education, of course, public service, health, social welfare in general, social policies. And this left hand, which is attacked by the right hand, that is economic and security inside the bureaucratic field, to put it rapidly again. And the term neoliberalism is not much used in La Misère du Monde, actually, but it's used. It's an adjective, neoliberal. But it's being more often used at that time in activist fields in France, around, for example, Politique La Revue, around Jacques Kergoat, and people whom we describe in Le Décembre, precisely. Between 92 and 95, Bourdieu is getting closer to these networks, where activists from NGOs, associations, as we say in French, political unions, and political organizations are present. And at the same time, he goes on developing an original, international, and first European international intellectual network, especially with Liber, Revue Européenne des Livres, that is the European Journal of Books, review of books. And so in November, December 95, he's actually already present as personnalité de référence in these national and international spheres. That's the reason why he's rapidly asked to revise actually a project of petition against the neoliberal Juppé reforms. To be a bit more precise, it's the suppression of a generous retirement scheme for railway workers. It also creates new conditions in health insurance, but worse conditions actually for the citizens. And we can sum it up as disguised austerity policy, actually. Which, of course, this petition, Bourdieu will rewrite it and diffuse it. And what struck us when we studied this with a group of doctoral students, friends of mine, Duval, Gobert, Marchetti, and Pavis, is the large symbolic capital that Bourdieu already held at that time in these activist spheres and more largely among intellectuals and in the media. That made him immediately central, very visible, symbolically very powerful. And this capital would actually increase in the following years with an even more international dimension. So you can understand that the reaction is strong and rather violent, actually. Bourdieu had been a supporter of Rocard, I mentioned, and also of a union, the CFDT, which is now supporting the Juppé reform and the neoliberal shift. And so Bourdieu has become a radical opponent to this neoliberal shift and this, let's say, rapidly pseudo-left, and therefore is seen as a traitor by mainstream center-left media. Esprit, for example, that Franck just mentioned. Bourdieu published in Esprit, then he had some disputes with Esprit, especially about La Distinction. Esprit had a very anti-Bourdieusian social philosophy, to sum up. And Esprit and the network around La Fondation Saint-Simon were closely linked to the neoliberal conversion of the left. Actually, they were direct actors of this conversion. Of course, for others in the mediatic and political field, more right-wing, Bourdieu is seen as a new figure of leftist intellectual irresponsibility, which is, in a sense, rather funny because Bourdieu was a pupil of Raymond Aron, was, in a sense, a kind of very heterodox and very critical inheritor of Raymond Aron, who was what became, in the 80s, the incarnation of right-wing responsible commitment. And so in his speech at the Gare de Lyon, the railway station, in front of the railway workers, the unionists, and also us, that is the young scholars committing with him, Bourdieu had put at the center of the process the leading role of economists and the stakes around economics economics, especially at the international level, that is in the IMF, the World Bank. I think this is a very original aspect of his commitment and in a sense new, which puts social sciences at the forefront of political struggles. Thank you.
Thank you, Frédéric. So in a way, it could have been as well the hollowing of the institutions of the welfare state and the strengthening of neoliberal policies that provoked his engagement and that contributed to the shift, to the evolution, as you said. A similar question for Gisèle Sapiro then. As you all saw in our invitation, one of the objectives of this roundtable is to understand how Pierre Bourdieu became a leading intellectual or a public intellectual, as it is referred to in the Anglophone world. So after having focused in his early years on pursuing a professional career as a social scientist, Gisèle Sapiro, to describe this evolution, you used a beautiful expression from social theorist to global intellectual. Would you first of all tell us how you explain this transition of Pierre Bourdieu's and also what the notion of the global intellectual means to you? We cannot hear you if you forgot to unmute.
Micro.
Apologies. I would like just thank you to add something to the very interesting description analysis that Frédéric just gave. I would like to add that the attacks against Bourdieu in 1995 were also attacks on his sociology, but it took pretext of the politics and his engagement to discredit his sociology because many of his opponents did not have the intellectual tools to dismiss his theory. I think it's an important point when you come into, so the fact that he engaged was a way to say, oh, this sociology is purely ideological. But now, and I would like to, of course, subscribe to what both said and Franck said also about the fact that Bourdieu's work was political and committed from the start in some way, because he was tackling always kind of a very hot problems, and but he was using the kind of tools of sociology for objectifying the unequal power relations in society. So in the research I did on the circulation of Bourdieu's work in translation, it was based on a quantitative analysis of his translated books that we did with Mauricio Bustamante. We could observe 4 phases of his reception in the world, roughly. In the first phase, Bourdieu's work was received in specific areas such as the sociology of education, sociology of culture, anthropology, his theory of practice and habitus. And he thus became a reference as a specialist of these domains. The translation, it was a translation of distinction in English that I mentioned before in 1984 with Harvard University Press that helped unify the reception of his theoretical framework. And he became a reference as a social theorist by that time. There were more and more works, collections about his theory as a whole, also articles in journals like Roger Brubaker was one of the first, and so suddenly rereading Bourdieu through Weber rather than Durkheim and Marx, which was beforehand the reading of Bourdieu. And so this American reception of distinction and beyond helped unify throughout the world his work, the image of him as a social theorist. But by the mid-1990s, as his work was getting more and more international, and international recognition, he put his renown at the service of a cause, following the model of French intellectuals tradition since Zola and since the Dreyfus affair, so that you engage, you commit yourself, you put your symbolic capital at the service of this cause. And Bourdieu's cause was the struggle against neoliberalism. But he also criticized the growing domination of the media on the political and cultural fields. His book on television was has been his most translated book. It's 25 languages until 2008, and it was the first of a series he launched in a small format and easier style, which was able to reach a wider audience. And so he was thinking about ways, so this is the format of the books, and this formula was a success and was imitated by others afterwards. So I think it was interesting to think how he thought about translating his sociology to a wider audience. We can say that since Bourdieu's death, there is also a new phase of reception. He's becoming a classical author, and this is testified by the numerous tributes like this one, new translations, conferences around the world. I remember I took part in the first conference in Chile a couple of years after his death. But I think it's very important not to transform Bourdieu's theory into a simple academic reference, and to keep alive its dynamic and critical and even subversive potential, both as a research program and as a social critique of the mechanism of domination and symbolic violence. So I think meeting like this one is very important to activate all these parts of his work. So what do I mean by global intellectual? I mean intellectuals that have intervention not only in the national settings, which is the more common framework, but do get a kind of international power, symbolic power, thanks to usually their renown. So it can be writers, but it can be, of course, more and more social scientists. And we have many examples of that. But I think Bourdieu's way of being a kind of global intellectual is probably different from those who are more kind of media intellectuals. And so he has a very specific, he defended, we will get probably back to this, but defended a very specific way of intervention based on research, on knowledge. And it's not an easy task, but I think he did succeed in doing that. And also we'll talk about also the collective dimension of this. You introduced that with the Bourdieu, with the Vacances notion of Bourdieu as a name for collective research. So we'll get back to this probably.
Thank you. I think you've just created another beautiful expression. You said to put one's symbolic capital at the service of a cause. Which is a beautiful way of answering this question.
Thank you so much, Gisèle, for this very interesting and inspiring answer. I would like to continue with Frederick Lebaron. In an article he wrote in the 1990s about the Yugoslav affair, Bourdieu fiercely denounced a kind of narcissistic exhibitionism that leads every intellectual to take an individual position or even to express or expose his little free form or his little opinion, as he put it. In fact, as we know, he advocated for collective work in a network which allows for combining the competencies of each and every member. He pleaded for the creation of an international autonomous collective intellectual who would become a real instrument of symbolic struggle, a tool for the diffusion of critical knowledge and a more direct intervention in public debate. Bourdieu elaborated the concept of the collective intellectual against the figure of the total intellectual embodied by Sartre, who could embrace all subjects in the extension of the specific intellectual defined by Foucault. Would you tell us, first of all, what is the logic behind this idea of Pierre Bourdieu's collective intellectual, and what remains of this idea today?
Yes, first in 1999, Bourdieu had become rather central in the permanently agitated sphere of social movements in France and Europe, and even more largely. And when he writes this text that you cite about former Yugoslavia, about the Kosovo war in May 1999, he actually reacts to international actuality as in a sense he has always done, at least since 1981. I will come back to that. For example, he signed a petition entitled Appel pour une paix juste et globale au Proche-Orient. That is almost the same title as the petition he supports and writes, in a sense, for the Kosovo. But it was against the first Iraq war in 1990-91, and against the French intervention in the Gulf. By the way, maybe this petition against the Iraq war was his first movement out of the pseudo-left that I already mentioned, since Mitterrand and Rocard were clearly, and other politicians from the Socialist Party, were clearly strongly in favor of NATO intervention against Saddam Hussein, against Iraq. This pseudo-left was clearly, and it was in a sense very new, very favorable, very enthusiastic with a military US intervention. And maybe it helped. It helped Bourdieu to, in a sense, well, wake up is a bit too much, but to become more conscious about the reality of what the French Socialist Party and its structural intellectuals had become. Again, one has to recall that Bourdieu and Foucault were seen as part of the so-called anti-totalitarian left. Foucault was quite closer to post-Sartrean mediatic intellectuals such as Kouchner or even Bernard-Henri Lévy, in a sense, after they intervened many years earlier, in 1981, 1982, against the French Socialist Communist Alliance in France. If you remember, the alliance was very annoyed by the situation in Poland and refused, in a sense, to condemn the coup by Jaruzelski. All this has been very precisely described by Eribon in his biography of Foucault, actually. In the 90s, Bourdieu moved to much more anti-imperialist, in a sense, even if he would not accept this qualification, probably, and more critical positions, but without, of course, becoming a supporter of Soviet-type communism or traditional left-wing revolutionary forces, which he had criticized for romanticism, abstract intellectualism, ethnocentrism, etc., especially in his Algerian period again. The Algerian period is a matrix, it's clear, of many things. He bases his international commitment on his international intellectual network, which is still important, and Gisèle has said many things about that, and his conception of universalism. I think that's very important, which is rooted in both the theory of fields, the notion of autonomy, is very important for that, and also a personal sort of reflex of his habitus of international solidarity, and with, for example, the Algerian situation in the beginning of the 90s. And you see the expression of that in the famous postscriptum of the Rules of Art, of Les Règles de l'Art, where he develops his idea of a corporatism of the universal. And during this period, it's true that Bourdieu projects his action in a more collective way, less and less on the Sartrean singular model of total intellectual, more on a more specific intellectual conception that is derived from Foucault, and a more collective. But already in the 80s, he wrote reports with his fellow colleagues from the Collège de France. The point is that they were more favorable to competition. They were not clearly neoliberal, one cannot say that, but they were clearly less progressive. They were, in a sense, sort of mandarins that wanted to reform the educational system, and Bourdieu had to fight against their positions, in a sense, to go more to progressive reform indications. That's the reason why he began Liber. Liber was a way to construct something new, and it's not by chance that he creates Liber around the fall of the Soviet-style communism, which in a sense creates a new space and a new opportunity for developing a real left that is both democratic and committed. And that's the reason why I think in the 90s, and especially after 95, he creates a series of collectives and invests an important part of his time in collective action in various ways. So that's, for example, of course, the Raison d'Agir group. Of course, I know it the best in a sense, but we have to mention that this group has international ramifications since the origin, that is since 95, with people like Franz Schultheis, Luc van Kampenhout, and other colleagues in Greece, for example, Nikos Panathopoulos and others, and also a national basis around colleagues from the Centre de Sociologie de l'Éducation et de la Culture, also coming from the Centre de Sociologie Urbaine, as it was named at the time, people like Gérard Mauger, Louis Pinto, Christophe Charles, Gabriel Balache, and others, and the young, Franck and me being part of the young, as we were called, the new generation. One could here add interesting remarks or comments about the fact that there is generational renewal in the group around Bourdieu. There are also gender imbalances and gender issues that still needs to be more investigated and in a sense more clearly understood. But this academic and intellectual network is clearly intertwined with more activist networks. That is especially small struggle NGOs. I came back to that with my own archives and many things and emails. That's the beginning of emails and I mean activist emails in the late 90s. And associations de lutte, assos de lutte, as we said, such as les marches européennes contre le chômage. Franck knows that very well with Patrice Padoni and others. Critical unions like Solidaire in Germany, IG Medien were part of this new network, very collective, not very dense. I mean, they were not very close, but we had names. We knew that we could contact people like Detlef Henschel, Claude Debron, or others who are sorts of heads of networks for us and important in this collective dimension. And with Moget, we developed this notion of, we said ICAI, Intellectuel Collectif Autonome International, which derives completely from this text by Bourdieu from the second half of the 90s. What I should say is that the notion of ICAI by itself doesn't give precise answers about the political all the political orientations, that it's not complete necessarily, but it expands the idea that typically Bourdieusian ideas that the dissemination of critical tools, that reflexive attitudes, that attention to empirical results of the social sciences, the complexity of consensus in these disciplines, the specificity of social sciences in general, are very important for political action. And I will conclude saying that the practical consequence of this conception is very much related to the diffusion of symbolic tools through various channels, such as alternative media, critical publishing houses. This is clearly in line with Bourdieu's notion of autonomy, and it's probably the major, let's say, output, or I don't know how to call it, of this conception of the collective intellectual. So that's publishing house, Édition Raison d'Agir, and other similar innovations or issues. And I think it remains totally relevant today, but modulo the fact that we are at the age of digitalization and many things have changed. I tried to argue that in my last book called Savoir et Agir, precisely. But for me, it should be reassessed in a context of even more powerful global economic actors like the GAFAM. We mentioned the importance, we mentioned Amazon, you mentioned Amazon, and it's clear that they are very central now, stronger. There is the importance of social media and a context where I think sciences, social and natural sciences are at the center of all stakes, which was already beginning to be the case in the middle of the 90s, but which is absolutely clear today.
Thank you so much, Frédéric. Philippe, I would like to ask you the following question. In 1999, with Pierre Bourdieu, you signed an appeal for peace, asking for an end to the bombing against Serbia and rejecting the false alternative between the NATO and Milosevic.
I did.
Briefly introduce us to the intellectual context in France and in the Western world in the late 90s, and explain was the difficulties of taking such a heterodox position at the time and in general.
Is it a question for me?
It is a question for Philippe Golub.
Ah, okay, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer specifically on the French intellectual context at the time. I think you...
sorry to interrupt. Would you mind raising your volume? It's a bit low. Or approaching the microphone. Thank you. Sorry.
My internet is very unstable. Can you hear me?
Yes. But
can you hear me?
We can hear you. The connection is well.
Okay, so I'll try to speak more loud. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm the best person. I'll repeat, the best person to answer specifically on the French intellectual context. I think Frédéric Lebaron can answer it better than I can, and I think that you, Ivica, can answer it probably better than I can in terms of its specifics, since you just finished your PhD on the issue, and having finished a PhD on the issue, you're actually the specialist on it. What I can say about it is that the appel was a political statement. Okay, so it's a political statement that was designed to shift the course of the discussion that was occurring at the time in France and beyond. I'm not sure if I can call it a discussion, actually. It was full of anathemas and excommunications and a lot of violence, actually, symbolic violence involved. But the appel was a political statement that aimed to lift a corner of the veil of dominant discourses that tended to legitimate, transfigure, and misrecognize and rendered misrecognizable actions of power and violence that fitted uneasily with the narratives of the time. I mean, the situation was one where, as you know, a great imperial power, that's what it was, what the United States was, and it's not clear that it still is, but a great imperial power clothed its purposes in the garb of universalistic aims, and where, on the other hand, a predatory state, the Serbian predatory state, clothed its predation and ethno-nationalism and ethno-nationalist violence in anti-imperialist garb. So what the appel actually tries to do in a very short and condensed way, and maybe Frédéric wants to say some things about that, is that the appel actually argued against both of those, against both the universalistic statements of the imperial power that was engaged in the bombing of Serbia, and on the other hand, against the fraudulently anti-imperialist, ethno-nationalist gangsters on the other, right? So, and it was an attempt to overcome that dichotomous reading of history. I mean, the overall intellectual situation at the time, and not so much France, but globally, was the emergence of a doctrine of humanitarian interventions in the context of the new ordering of the world in the post-Cold War, in which the United States had become the overwhelmingly dominant power and gave itself the right, along with some of its allies, to intervene regularly, consistently, in the domestic affairs of other states in the name of domestic universalism, which Bourdieu opposed. Bourdieu opposed the universalistic imperial conceptions that were behind that, and he actually calls these imperial universalisms, universal imperialisms and imperial universalism. So I think the context was one in which a critique, an emerging critique was required to put into question the new ethos. It was a kind of new ethos of imperial interventionism that was occurring, that were being undertaken under fraudulent guises. But maybe others would like to comment on that.
Thank you, Philip. So as you've said, I think after completing his PhD precisely on these topics, Ivica among us is probably the most specialized to explain the context here at the time. But I think you certainly done a great job in painting the picture of the difficulty of taking a stance that's neither simplistically binary pro or against. And we've interrupted Frederick Lebaron for a moment, who wanted to say something as well. No.
No, I totally agree with what Philippe described as regards this call. What I just wanted to add is a factual element about the collective around Bourdieu at that time. It was composed especially of women. I remember the three Catherine Samari, Catherine Tricot, and Catherine Lévy. It was quite interesting to see that at that time he thought, I have mails that testify it, that would be the basis of an international group again that he wanted at that time to create. And I think he spent a large part of his last years trying to create collectives that sometimes were quite important in the public sphere, sometimes failed, but it's life. I mean, it's the life of collectives and initiatives, I think.
Thank you, Frédéric. Would you like to add something? So I will proceed with the questions as planned. It's not that far context-wise the following question, because it refers to the state and the state's influence. And this question is directed to Franck Poupeau. So Franck Poupeau, you directed the posthumous publication of the Collège de France courses that Pierre Bourdieu gave between 1989 and 1992 on the question of the state. In 2003, you published the book, The Sociology of the State, the School and its Experts in France. According to Marx, the state is part of the superstructure based on the infrastructure represented by by relations of production. Marx also believed that the state is everything but neutral, so that it takes a position in class struggles and that is not a neutral arbiter, but that it favors the ruling class by securing the structures and organizations of the capitalist mode of production. Bourdieu argues that politics and the state are above all characterized by the phenomena of power, but he presents us with quite a different analysis. Could you tell us what exactly Bourdieu sees as the role of the state and politics in the functioning of society?
Well, that's a difficult question. First of all, I would like to mention that On the State, the book, which we should have maybe named The Invention of the State, was edited with a collaboration of Patrick Champagne, Rémi Lenoir, Marie-Christine Rivière, and also with a big contribution of Louis Vacan. I will also, as a preliminary remark, say that to talk about the state in Bourdieu's sociology is not always talking about state. He was talking about the state before his work on in La Misère du Monde. But for example, in La Reproduction, you won't find the word state, for example. In any work on education, etc. So there is a kind of evolution of Bourdieu perspective, and this evolution has been mentioned by Frédéric when he talks about the experience of Bourdieu inside the state since the 80s with reports he made for the government in education, and after that with the Michel Rocard experience. But to another primary remark is to say that finally, Bourdieu not always refers to Marx on the state. He refers to Marx and many other issues, but on the state, he is quite critical of this analysis, especially with Marxist, French Marxist theorists like and the notion of appareil idéologique d'État, which he criticizes a lot. And that's why he builds the notion of a bureaucratic field. So to go to the main questions that you made, I will refer to an article I published, I don't know when, in 2015-16 in the Berkeley Journal of Sociology, after the edition of On the State. Basically, there are 3-4 points to answer to your question. First of all, Bourdieu was clearly aware of the way in which the French state had remodeled traditional society since the 19th century. And he mentions this indirectly in the course On the State when he addresses the double face of the state, domination and integration, monopolization and unification. So it's not a question of an antinomy between two theories, Marxism versus French Republican theory, but for Bourdieu, an antinomy inherent in the very functioning of the state. That's to say, the modern state is at once progress towards universalization, that's to say, departicularization of local culture, etc., and a vector of the monopolization of the same universal and a concentration of power in order to achieve it. And Bourdieu adds in the course on the state, in French edition is page 351, in certain way, it could be said that integration, which should be understood in the Durkheimian sense, but also in the sense of those who talked about the integration of Algeria, is the precondition of domination. So Bourdieu cites cultural unification as a condition of cultural domination, the unification of the linguistic market, which creates patois, bad accents, dominated languages, in the same way that the unification of the market of symbolic goods explains celibacy, in Béarn especially. This idea of a process of unification that is at the same time a process of universalization, which Bourdieu presents as a break with Weber and Elias, is associated with the construction of a unified social space linked to the state as, I will quote Bourdieu, a holder of a meta-capital that makes it possible to partially dominate the way in which various fields function. So this unification of a homogeneous and departicularized space occurs in relation to a central locus, which in the French case attains its limits, that tends to replace personal relations with territorial relations by considering groups linked to the state, like jurists, for example. So it would be, I could develop much more all these ideas, and but it's important to understand that Bourdieu finally did not so much change over state than he focused on one side or on the other side. So that's why he could criticize the social reproduction role of the state in la reproduction, and defend the public services, especially on education in the 90s. That's part of the same reality. Just 2 points to go on with that and to conclude. So Bourdieu examines the unification of the national state and the obligatory education, the education system being an instrument of integration, which enables, of course, submission, as we saw it in the French case. But before moving to another example of unification, this time of the marriage market, he makes a kind of resume of the colonization of the French countryside. He evokes the phenomenon of male celibacy in Béarn as the incarnation of the unification of the market of symbolic goods in which women circulate. And in this sense, the protected local market is annexed by the national market, notably by means of the education system and the media. And I mentioned the participation of Bourdieu to state commissions, but one of his reference, once again, in his elaboration of the analysis of the state is Algeria, again, when he points that submission and depossession are not antagonistic to integration. And indeed, integration is a precondition. This mode of slightly twisted thought is difficult because we are used to thinking of integration as the opposite of exclusion. And it is hard to understand that to be excluded or to be dominated, one must be first integrated. And so if we take the example of the struggle about French Algeria, we should ask why the most unfavorable to integration become, in a certain moment, integrationist. It's because in order to dominate the Arabs, it was necessary to integrate them, to transform them into Bourdieu, Bourdieu says, racially scorned, dominated individuals. So this double reality of the state explains many misunderstandings, I think. And the last point I would say is that this double reality of the state is also the double reality of Bourdieu in his trajectory. That this finally is function as a kind of product of French school, French elite, or French academic elite, and his rebellion against this system is also at the core of his analysis of the state as a double function of integration and domination, unification and monopolization. Yeah, there will be many things to say about it, but I will stop on this point.
Thank you so much, Franck. As you mentioned Marxism and Marxist, I would like to continue with you, Frederick Lebaron, and ask you the following question. When we talk about Marxism today, for example, it is always in the plural because there have always been many Marxist currents. We remember even that Marx criticized some Marxists in France when he was still alive, saying that if they are Marxist, he himself is not. On the other hand, it is harder to discern sharp distinctions, line of fracture among the Bourdieusians. Why do you think this is so? Is it because Bourdieu's oeuvre is as much about method as it is about theory building? Or perhaps that it does not contain the explicitly normative and teleological elements of most Marxist thought? Or is there another more appropriate explanation?
Thanks for this very interesting but very difficult question. I think the comparison with Marx and Marxism is both fascinating, important, but also a bit misleading. Marxist writings and Marxism as a doctrine expanded at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, in the Second International, of course in the Third and the Fourth afterwards, and inside organizations, national organizations, unions, political parties of the workers' movement, in Germany first, then they spread in France, in various countries, of course, Russia and China. And Marxism gave to these organizations a set of doctrinal consistent elements, which in a sense allow the structuration of discourses, performative discourses. Bourdieu speaks about that with the notion of theory effects or effects of theory, I don't know how to translate in English, which themselves, these theory effects, realizing the working class, allows the structuration of the class as a subject, as a political and economic subject. Of course, with the help of intellectuals, in an alliance, a particular alliance between particular professionalized, in a sense, intellectuals that are the organic intellectuals. They are professionalized in the political sense, and the dominated, and some sectors of the dominated classes, that is the working class and so on. And it's clear that in this sense, what you call in your question, Marxism as a clear normative dimension, the theory of exploitation is in a sense a very moral philosophy and theory, and also theological. It's clear with the advent of a classless society and aspects that clearly refer to sort of religious myths, or at least representations. Even if it's also a scientific research program, but in a second way, in a sense, or secondary way, with empirical controversies, example of controversy around Bernstein and the revisionism and so on. And I think this situation even dramatically changed with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, when the doctrine was incorporated as a state doctrine, as a central state doctrine with the Soviet Union. And then a set of countries, until today, it's still the doctrine, the basic reference of states today, and not the unimportant state in the power relations at the global level, I mean China. And one should never forget this empirical reality of Marxism and what Marx has become today, actually. There may be some sociologists in power that may happen very rarely compared to economists or political scientists, but the sociology of Bourdieu has never been part of the official doctrine of an organization, as far as I know. Can be a reference, but not more, and obviously of any state. I mean, there is no Bourdieusian philosophy that is institutionalized at the level of a state. So Bourdieu's theory is developing first in the international scientific field. It's clear that makes a strong difference. Now, through necessarily partial theoretical improvements or reorganizations, there are many theoretical debates on the notion of capital, debates on the integration of the dynamics into the model, and of course empirical controversies, which are very alive today. I mean, the controversies about the distinction model, for example, are very important and interesting today. But there are many others about intellectual fields. The notion of field itself is a matter of a big scientific controversy that is not over. I think that is still going on, and we have, I mean, many poles in this controversy. So, and it's clear that one must be realistic. The Bourdieusian theory, methods, concepts, tools, even the more political that he developed, are less present in the political field. My thought, for example, inside unions or inside NGOs, my thought on that is that it should be more, it's clear, but the process is complex. That should be the case through an influence on the way politicians refer to science, for example, and the way they integrate in their action, in their daily action, results, but also approaches and ways of thinking, including concepts from sociology, base their discourse on what is accumulated in our fields. That's the point that I argue in my last book. How about the collective intellectual and the Bourdieusians that you mentioned? It's not that homogeneous, I think. There are individual trajectories at the international level in the global scientific or intellectual field. I will mention Loïc Vacan, I will mention Gisèle Sapiro, I will mention Didier Ribon, I will mention Franz Schultheis, with very strong diversity, with very diverse connections to political spheres and unions and other social actors. They have their own networks. They are involved in collective action, of course. There are also small collectives, such as the group around Raison d'Agir. The Raison d'Agir publisher is still a collective that is alive, and Franck is here too, and Gisèle as well, participating to it. There was a group around Agone. It's a bit less the case. It may be more the publisher or d'attente now. And there is the Savoir Agir Association, which I tried to, with other friends like Gérard Mauger or Nicole Val, to maintain alive. And yes, there are some differences between us in organizational style, in political orientation sometimes, or relation to various organizations. That was a matter of debate in the last years or months around Bourdieu, for example. There were polls. There was a more radical and a more, say, social democrat or democratic socialist. I don't know how to name it. I think it's less visible. The point is that these oppositions that are not tensions, that's life, I think, but that come from in a sense the fact that we relate to the external world. We are not completely autonomous, and we have to deal with the fact that we have some affinities with sectors of social movements or sectors of resistant forces that explain also the fact that it's less easy to see the Bourdieusian as a political unified force. It's in a sense impossible and probably not preferable, I would say.
Thank you so much, Frédéric, for this very, very interesting answer. I would like to ask Gisèle Sapiro. We are very often hear that Pierre Bourdieu is a determinist, which serves his opponents to delegitimize his sociology. You often mention that the opposite of methodological determinism is not individual freedom, but le hasard, or chance in English. Jacques Boverès has pointed out very well that some of our greatest philosophers, Spinoza and Leibniz, for example, as well as Freud, were more rigorous determinists than Bourdieu, but we really rarely come close to this fact. My hypothesis is that Pierre Bourdieu's social determinism is perceived as menacing precisely because of this faulty understanding of freedom and its potential political implications. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. So as Boverès explains, a minimum of methodological determinism is necessary. Otherwise, you cannot do any science. As you say, and it was Maurice Schlick who pointed this, the contrary of determinism is not freedom, but chance, hazard. Any scientific explanation requires a set of explanatory factors. So this text takes us back to the big controversy about the human and social sciences versus the natural sciences. Can mechanical causality be applied to human beings who have intentions, representation, choice, reflexive thought, or should we develop a specific comprehensive approach based on hermeneutics following Dilthey? Phenomenology, as you know, opposed behaviorism on this basis. And Bourdieu was trained in phenomenology, so he would never admit mechanical causality and would include representations and beliefs as part of the object. And this was there since the sketch for theory of practice. But still, like Max Weber, he does want to identify laws in human behavior. So his sociology is not looking for deterministic causal mechanism in the same way as in physics. The social sciences are, and Philippe Golub mentioned that, the social sciences are working on probabilistic laws, like in medicine, and also on tendency laws, like in economy. when Bourdieu and Passeron in the Inheritors calculate the chance to access university according to the social origin, it is not a deterministic law, it is a probability. What Bourdieu's theory of habitus and capital says is that the room of maneuver you have vary according to your resources and skills, meaning economic, social, and cultural capital, or under the communist and unique party regimes, your political capital. Sometimes one depends on the other. In countries where higher education is paying, economic capital conditions the acquisition of cultural capital, except for a very small proportion of scholarships. The value of the different resources may also vary from field to field. Economic capital is not sufficient resource in the educational field in the sense that you cannot buy a diploma. You need some achievements. Same in the field of cultural production. The social world is all about conversion of economic capital into symbolic capital and vice versa. For instance, winning an important literary prize increases the sales of the book. So it's converting symbolic capital into economic capital. So this is why Bourdieu uses the concept of strategy, which means agency and the capacity to improvise in new situations, which depend both on your dispositions, that is to say your habitus, and we discuss in the dictionary other laws and effects in the that Bourdieu thought about. For instance, what he called the Gershenko Effect, the fact that capitalism did not develop in Russia as in England or in France because it appeared later. And so Bourdieu transposes this law to this effect to disciplines. So for instance, the social sciences and humanities as opposed to the natural sciences. Or another is the Don Quixote effect, the inertia of habitus when the social world changes. So, and here we are in a matter of historical causality, which has nothing to do with mechanical causality. And this is something that Max Weber was very interested in thinking about what historical causality is. And there is another law to which he didn't give a specific name, but it's the fact that the more the situation is risky, the more the interactions will be codified and formal. So there is a real bad faith in the reduction of Bourdieu's sociology to determinism. And I would say that this faulty understanding of freedom derives itself from the resistance to acknowledge the social factors that restrict our freedom and room of maneuver. It is due to the denial of the arbitrariness of privilege and of the social conditions for acquiring cultural capital. Symbolic violence, according to Bourdieu, precisely stems from the collective denial of the mechanism of domination, and his sociology aims at unveiling this mechanism. And for Bourdieu, unveiling this mechanism, which will have an emancipatory effect and help us enlarge this room of maneuver and try avoid reproducing them. However, as he underscores in Masculine Domination, becoming conscious is not sufficient because we have internalized these schemes of perception, evaluation, and action in our bodies in the course of our first and secondary socialization. And they are part of our habitus, and they are like a second nature, which is very hard to get rid of. And this is the biggest obstacle to our freedom. As Bourdieu argues, the main thing that education instills into us is a sense of one's place, meaning to adjust ourselves to new situations by spontaneously excluding options that are not for us, inaccessible. For instance, access to some luxury goods or to property or to higher education.
Thank you, Gisèle. I would like to ask a question now for Franck Poupeau. So Franck, in 2012, you published the book, The Misadventures of Criticism, in the Raison d'Agir édition that was created by Pierre Bourdieu with the idea of making scientific knowledge more accessible to the general public. In this book, you propose a very useful reflection on sociology in general, as well as the political stakes around the renewal of critical thinking. For example, you very convincingly evoke the emergence of an increasingly subtle and invisible domination, mixing constraint and adherence, moral conformism and logical conformism, ignorance and recognition. If I may advance this idea, in a way your analysis adds an additional layer to Pierre Bourdieu's sociology that is often linked to the treatment of social phenomena that are too static. So social struggles, for example, are often considered to lack individual initiative, but rather to arise from objective social conditions. Pierre Bourdieu describes the movement of the unemployed as a social miracle. To express his own trajectory, even in social success, he used the word miraculé when referring to himself, or miraculous exception, referring to someone who has escaped his social fate. With all of this in mind, I would like to know your opinion on the tools of Bourdieu's critical sociology that enables the dominated to act and escape their fate.
Well, I try to be synthetic. Originally in this book, I wanted to develop the idea of what I call the capital militant, militant capital, these techniques that activists do develop in their commitments. One of the points of this notion was to try to generalize Bourdieu's theory of Bourdieu's analysis of the conditions of politicization. You know, when he makes the link between cultural capital and political opinions. And it was to say that if it's not only cultural capital or scholar capital, but also all the learning processes you can get into a political organization or a syndical organization. That's why I was trying to develop this notion of capital militant, and to say that finally commitment or at least politicization were not so easy and were not so natural. Finally, I changed my mind in the book because of the context of what was happening in France 10 years ago, and the critics of that were generalized, especially by people like Rancière, about it's an old critic about the division or the rupture between people who know sociologists and people who don't know. And it seemed to me that at the time there was kind of common agreement of many perspectives, postmodern perspective, post-colonial perspective, pragmatist perspectives, into a kind of spontaneous view of politics and mobilizations. And so I had seen that in the naturalization of the mobilization of indigenous communities in South America, but also in Rancière's work or in the work of James Scott about popular groups and their immediate and natural commitment. So that was the main objective. And I think if we want to analyze why domination is so strong, and especially symbolic domination, it's not to say that only sociology can fight it. It's just to say that in the context of development or very subtle forms of symbolic domination, you cannot develop mobilization without learning processes, finally, and without kind of education of groups that are concerned by this domination. So it's kind of also of reference to the very strong tradition of the popular movement in Europe with popular education, etc. Last point is, it was not clear for me at the time, but finally, if I try to say it in a different way, it's not only to stay on analysis of domination and of the conditions of possibility of access to politics. That's to say, not only to think of what might mobilize people, but also how to disseminate knowledge against symbolic domination. And in this way, as Gisèle mentioned it earlier, Bourdieu's theory, which is not only academic, but also a very strong critical perspective beyond the scientific field, offers tools to make ruptures with this symbolic domination. It's a large and collective process. That's what I would say at the moment. The difficulty is, and I think I didn't do it so well in the book, is try to not to say that sociologists have the response. It's just to say that sociological tools might be incorporated to political work of mobilization. Thanks.
Thank you, Franck. Precisely what you're saying about the tools and what Gisèle was saying as well make me think of another, by now you've realized that I'm a sucker for beautiful words and expressions, and I hold on to them. And one of those was used recently by Philip Golub at another lecture at the Institute, when he referred to a part of the problem, what you're talking about, the lack of understanding or education about sources of domination. He referred to it as the misrecognition of the sources that strengthen domination. So in a way that could be a contributing factor to the strengthening of domination, misrecognizing the source of it. So therefore, my final question I'll address to Philip and then leave it to Ivica and the rest of you for the final one. That is a collective question that will hopefully bring together all of this work. So Philip, you published a critique this year of the notion of soft power entitled Soft Power, Soft Concepts and Imperial Conceits, that mobilizes Bourdieu's readings of symbolic power and violence and uses a Bourdieusian framework. The aim of this critique was to bring to light what you call the imperial cosmologies, embedded in the performative discourses of the powerful. Could you discuss this and tell us how you think Bourdieu can be integrated into international political theory? We saw how his sociological tools could be integrated and used practically, and maybe it will be interesting to talk about this now.
Yes, well, thank you for that. The notion of misrecognition, actually, I borrowed from Bourdieu. Okay, so that statement that you quoted comes from Bourdieu's work on symbolic domination.
We don't hear you very well. If you could speak.
So I borrowed the concept of misrecognition from Bourdieu, actually, and his discussion of symbolic domination and symbolic power. My own work recent work on soft power, critique of soft power, came out of a larger critique of imperial cosmologies and the way in which, in the course of modernity and afterwards, colonization, empire, and post-imperial politics, certain symbolic forms of domination emerge that actually lead to the production and reproduction of international inequality. So by imperial cosmologies, what I meant were the multifaceted representations at symbolic level that actually lead to the production and reproduction of international inequality, including of course, the notion of cultural superiority and cultural domination. And I introduced recently soft power into that as a concept that precisely leads to misrecognition, euphemization, and transformation of the notion of power, which is a dominant power, into something which is something quite different. Actually, transformation concept into something which is radically different. In fact, the contrary of what it purports to actually signify. My effort on the critique of soft power is part of an attempt to use both Bourdieu and other frameworks. I also use Gramsci in that paper, and Gramsci's notion of ideological hegemony to mobilize Bourdieu's framework in international political theory. And it's a field that's growing. It's not the most prominent field of Bourdieu studies. There have been a number of collective books that have been published on Bourdieu and international relations theory and Bourdieu and world politics, but it's not yet sufficiently furnished. So it opens up spaces for investigations, which I think are extremely important in the international system today. And one of the works that I think is particularly relevant for you, just to cite one among many, I think that Gisèle's work on the international circulation of expertise is a particularly well-focused Bourdieusian critique that can be integrated into and in my work has been integrated international relations theory in very productive ways. And in particular, the way in which governance, international governance, the field of international governance, plays into imperial politics, where prescriptive and purportedly universalist discourses, such as human rights, economic development, or other things of this type, in fact, lead to forms of intellectual domination at world level. And if you think of the agenda setting activities of institutions such as the international public organizations, the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the European Commission, very prominent within that, or power-bearing private clubs such as the World Economic Forum, the Eurogroup, or other transnational private institutions of that kind, actually set agendas and make knowledge claims that are universalistic knowledge claims that actually lead to forms of praxis that generate not only symbolic domination, but actual physical domination, material domination in various fields. And you could see this during the Eurozone crisis. During the Eurozone crisis, there was a discourse of knowledge and power that actually was implemented that led to the submersion and fracture of Europe into dominant and dominated spaces. So the international circulation of expertise is a very good example of the kind of field in which you can apply Bourdieu to international relations theory, but I think you can apply it just as well on concepts and ideas and emerging ideas such as soft power in a critical way to make international relations theory, to bring into international relations theory a richer and denser understanding of the actual ways in which the dimensions of power play out at international and global level.
Thank you all so very much for this lively and inspiring debate. I have one final short question for all of you. The idea of the end, or at least the decline of intellectuals, is defended in a significant number of texts published over the last 30 years. This idea was evoked even before Pierre Bourdieu's involvement in the social and intellectual struggles of the 90s. I'm curious to know how you see this hypothesis and what is, in your opinion, the role and place of intellectuals in contemporary societies and in social struggles. Maybe start with Philippe Golub, then we will continue with Frederick Lebaron and Franck Poupeau, and finish with Gisèle Sapiro. Philippe, the word is yours.
Okay, I mean, I'm going to be really short on this. I think, first of all, there's a classical role, which is the role, making sense of the social world in an age in which the profusion and confusion of information and of knowledge actually has become extremely, difficult to, the intertwined links to try to clarify them, to actually show the processes at work, the lawfulness of certain processes and the way in which they work. So making sense of the social world in a historic and genetic sense, but also showing the new emerging patterns of politics. And in particularly doing so in a way, in a critical fashion, in a new age of inequality, which needs to be theorized and then transformed into various forms of praxis, both scientific praxis and political praxis, I think. That, I think, is the first and perhaps most important such action. And the second one is what we've all been discussing tonight, which is the creating public spaces. That if there's a role of the intellectual, the collective intellectual in any case, the collective intellectual is to create public space, to create public spaces where precisely issues can be clarified, brought to light, and in which the phenomena, which are not easily understood or mastered, can be given more clarity and mastery by people who actually need to use these concepts from the social sciences to be able to own their own lives, to become self-determining actors, at least in part.
Frédéric?
Yes, I tried to analyze this issue in 2015 editorial of Savoir Agir, which is republished in my last book. I ironically entitled this editorial Vers le retour des intellectuels, towards a comeback of intellectuals, which of course I see as collective and international, the Ikai that I mentioned before. For me, it's a typical buzz of mainstream media and politicians to regularly deplore the decline or the death of intellectuals, and Bourdieu had reacted to that in the 80s already. Politicians such as Manuel Valls, former so-called socialist prime minister under the so-called socialist President François Hollande, or more recently our Minister of Education, the very right-wing Jean-Michel Blanquer, have begun to directly attack intellectuals for being insufficiently mobilized against Islamism or even for being too sympathetic to their cause, Islamo-gauchism. It's a bit paradoxical position, but the dominant media and the dominant actors, political actors, change all the time. Is it a decline, a death, or is it a too strong presence, but on the bad side, that is the left side? At the same time, we have mediatic intellectuals who are still there, and the ones that, those people who only exist in the mediatic sphere are more and more permeable to racism, to anti-Semitism, and to extreme right-wing positions. So there, we have to do something. I think more or less the contrary. I think scientists, including social scientists, are at the center of the stakes today, including this year with the COVID-19 crisis. There were epidemiologists, there are in a sense social scientists, there are at least scientists, economists and other social scientists have a lot to say and a lot to do, and a lot of work remains to be done in order to understand what happens and what happened. But our conditions of interventions have dramatically changed. I think we should not only acknowledge it, but take that more seriously into account. We in France have a remaining rather centralized Parisian conception of the intellectual, and also very literary and singular conception. He's publishing books. He's publishing in intellectual journals like Les Temps Modernes or Le Débat. By the way, both have recently died. In major for-profit publishers, commercial generalist publishers. They write texts in Le Monde, en Libération. They sign petitions for the same audience as these newspapers. Bourdieu shared, in a sense, this model to some extent, but and he even developed it at a global level, as Gisèle has shown. He was a global intellectual, but he began as well to challenge it in the second half of the 90s with new, more independent collections of smaller books of interventions, supporting alternative journals, magazines, newspapers of various sorts, including satiric magazines, mobilizing through more organized collectives, which would be more independent from mainstream politicians and media. And I think with digitalization, these evolutions are more obvious and more central today. Part of the intellectual struggles are centered on Twitter. There are battles of threads. We saw that with medical doctors and biologists this year, on blogs, on online direct publications, including scientific results now, which are most of the time directly published online. And there are various interpretations. We have the good example, I think, of the work by Thomas Piketty. Of course, he's the example of a global intellectual as well, because he published a book, a classical, I would say, global intellectual as well. He published a very diffused and celebrated book, but he also developed activities on websites with interactive data analysis websites about inequalities. And I think it's the modernity of our work. We have to think of that. Collectives and activists remain weak, I think, and I think that's something we have to deplore. It's clear we are not in a very bad shape, very good shape at the moment, but the reason may be that there is a large disconnection between fields, and I think in a sense it's good that the fields are autonomous, but we have to work on the interdependencies between fields, the solidarities between fields, and therefore I think now that we should recreate more interdependencies between the scientific field and the field of unions, the field of NGOs, some sectors of the political field, the ones that are not devoted to a pure reproduction of the social order. And I think it was the initial idea of Bourdieu and Foucault in the 80s. They were in a sense captured by another political and intellectual project, but in the 80s. But Bourdieu came to this idea, and I think this is still a general and critical issue as such. In times of growing social inequality, in times of anomia, we have a certain responsibility here. I think it's a serious issue. I think we should try to organize new kinds of social solidarity, maybe in line with the analysis of La Misère du Monde and all this project, which I think is an utopia, but a very beautiful utopia, and at the same time very important, of the economy of happiness that Bourdieu developed in his last days. I don't mean here only verbal and symbolic solidarity, but also material and financial. I think we should rethink that the success of the workers' movement was, in a sense, to create the idea of welfare state, the idea of welfare solidarity by concrete actions connected to intellectual struggle. I think we have to reinvent that. We should reinvent solidarity at a global scale. It's really important to think in these terms, I think. Linking, for example, the diffusion of sociological qualitative, narrative, but also quantitative accounts of various sorts of misery, misery of condition, poverty, absence of future, misery of positions, including the misery of position of academics in more and more precarized and impoverished institutions. And we should, I think, to finish, give people collective projects in which they could create perspective for the future. So sociologists without borders unite.
Thank you, Frédéric. Franck, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with what Philippe and Frédéric said, and especially the idea of interaction between the fields, which is a key point, and to stay inside Bourdieu's framework. I don't have a research or just some impressions to talk about this decline. That would be a decline of the autonomy of the intellectual field with all the limits that Frédéric mentioned. Of course, we can refer to external factors, the impact of economy, of the medias, etc., on the intellectual life. But I would just like to focus on, or to mention only internal factors. The fact that in the intellectual world and in the academic positions, there is less money, and there is big debate about the recent reforms with all the precarization of academic employees, all the process of evaluation, etc. All these internal factors contribute to reduce the capacity of transformation of the fields, the capacity of feminization of external elements into the own rules and norms of the intellectual field. That would be a first element of response, but I suppose that on this kind of issue, Gisèle has got much more precise elements. To end on an optimistic perspective, I would say that despite of the differentiation of the fields, and especially, for example, as I see it from my position, as a differentiation of the editorial markets and the invisibilization of alternative productions, for example, there is also a multiplication of the production, and in that way, I think the main what's at stake for us is to create or recreate the conditions of kind of collective work, collective project, not to get back to the forms of proletariat intellectuals that Bourdieu always mentioned after Weber, that produce what we said between the two world wars, and that are a very big risk now. So with this multiplication of alternative productions and the potentiality of collective work that still have to be built, maybe there is something to get out of the actual pessimistic view of the intellectual field. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Franck. Gisèle, please, the word is yours.
Yeah, so the critique of intellectuals can be taken back to the Dreyfus affair. Barres already criticized their involvement as being a kind of abusing their authority and knowledge. But of course, I think one of the turning points is May 68 and the critique of authority of writers and of all those intellectuals, which is totally related to the extension of the growing of education, so which ask what is the specific privilege of the intellectual today. But the idea of the decline of intellectuals emerged specifically in France in the 1980s as well, first in the context of Sartre's death and the victory also of the Socialist Party in 1981, and it was related to the marginalization of the figure of the leftist intellectual in the context of the rise of expert knowledge. And you can find a special issue of Esprit in 1981 on the intellectual silence. And this decline was, by the end of the decade, more broadly connected to the absurd notion of the end of history in relation to the fall of communism. And during the 1980s, the anti-communist ideology attacked the intellectuals who supported the communist regimes as irresponsible and tried to discredit them. And a new form of relationship between intellectuals and the government emerged with the model of the think tanks, the think tanks imported from the United States with the Fondation Saint-Simon. And in the context of the first war in Iraq, also this motto of the intellectual silence came back. As social scientists were getting enrolled in governmental expertise, the mediatic intellectuals, especially the so-called new philosophers, occupied more and more public space in France. And it was the case in the war in ex-Yugoslavia, as you know. And Bourdieu's reflections on the collective intellectual emerged by that time at the beginning of the 1990s, as Frédéric mentioned, and he was thinking of a way to put expert knowledge at the service of the dominated rather than of the dominant. And this is how he launched this association Raison d'Agir, about which Frédéric spoke before. And I would just like to highlight the underlying ideas. As you mentioned, Foucault and Bourdieu criticized Sartre's model of the total intellectual as acting on all fronts, and Foucault proposed the figure of the specific intellectual who intervenes based on her specialty. But he proposed that this expert knowledge, instead of being neutral, takes us back to the former question, neutral and adjusted to governmental or economic demand, be critical and respond to the demand of for protest. And he himself started working on, Foucault started himself working on prisons as he was engaging against the penitentiary system. So this model of commitment was better adapted to the social sciences than that of the prophetic intellectual embodied by writers like Zola or a philosopher like Sartre. Bourdieu added, we said that to this specific engagement, the collective dimension of research, no one in the social science can embrace the whole domain of specialized knowledge, and collaboration and division of labor is necessary, as well as the cumulative methods of science. And this is why he created Raison d'Agir. In practice, it means working on objects that are left aside by governmental policy, but also analyzing reflexively the state demand for expertise. For instance, Franck's work on the calls about research on education, how it frames our way of thinking, and of course, being critical about intellectuals themselves. And note that the media always wanted Bourdieu to appear alone, and he had to fight to impose the names of his collaborators, and Frédéric and Franck can attest this. For me, this is a model of commitment that is more relevant than ever, and some associations such as Fondation Copernic play such a role, but are much less visible in the public space. And this does not, for me, replace strikes and demonstrations and petitions and other items of the traditional repertoire of collective action, but it can bring them some support and also some data and analysis. I would like to add that the past year social movement in France was the theater of new modes of protest of the intellectuals and artistic professions, on which we worked with my students as form of participant observation. We saw lawyers throwing their robes, teachers throwing their books, dancers dancing outside the Bastille, and so on. And it was a very creative movement that was unfortunately interrupted by the pandemic. But these new modes of action are now part of the repertoire. And so, but now in I think the context of the pandemic, we are now seeing restriction of freedom. And it's not only about neoliberalism, now it's all the security issues and the pandemic and all this authoritarian turn that I think we can define it as such. So I think there is an international solidarity that has to be built, and not only against neoliberalism, but also against this authoritarian turn, defending freedom in general, but also academic freedom, because academic freedom is now menaced. And we are trying to build such networks around academic freedom with exiled intellectuals. Of course, there is all the migrant issue that requires really great, I mean, very large networks, and there are people who are going every day, I mean, to help the migrants and refugees, and I would just end with the. So I think Frédéric was totally right about Piketty being a kind of the new embodiment of this kind of specific intellectual, and also working in a collective manner, but putting also his renown in the service of defending social justice. And but there are new. I mentioned global intellectuals earlier, so I've been working recently on literary festivals, and some of the literary festivals have become arenas for kind of a new emergence of a new figure of the feminized, very often figure of intellectual from the so-called third world. For instance, the Berlin Festival is a place where each opening is there is a lecture given by a female writer, or not only female writers, but many of them are women who are protesting against abuse of governments in their countries, and who are also risking a lot by doing that. And I think France is a bit, and perhaps maybe also Europe, a bit disconnected from this global sphere, and we have to connect them more. And I also agree with what my colleague said before about connecting all the spheres, and also the culture. I mean, now the culture is also under kind of terrible crisis. So I stop here.
Thank you, Gisèle. Just to touch upon something that you mentioned about the pandemic kind of being a fruitful ground for the strengthening of authoritarian tendencies, if I may say, worldwide. We have seen that in our case as well, and I would like to remind you all and thank you again for your contribution in the petition this summer that showed us that we at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory in Belgrade are not just a small local national institute, but a part of a larger international academic community. And it's precisely these kinds of initiatives and your way of thinking and working on Bourdieu that enable a different terrain for Bourdieu as well today, and the importance of all the people listening and participating in this two-day conference to be able to use the same tools, the same methodology used in the times that Bourdieu worked in, and probably today, and to continue his oeuvre. And I wanted to let you know, if you were not aware, that we will have a direction d'ouvrage as a result of this conference coming spring or summer, and we would appreciate that your contributions be a part of it as well. Of course, we will translate it because it's intended to be in the regional languages in Serbo-Croatian. So just on guise as a concluding remark, I would like to say that we were all talking about the importance of public spaces and the dangers of the suppression of them. And in a way, what we are doing here, we are creating, no matter how clumsily and with hesitation, a new form of a public space in lack of others, awaiting to be able to be together in different ways. So we are very much appreciative and grateful for allowing us to have this moment with all of you being in different parts of not only France. Franck Poupeau is joining us from Bolivia, and our gratitude is just too long to express in words at this moment. I will try to moderate this public space as best as I can, because we have questions on YouTube where we have the live stream. And I would also like to open it up for the questions here in the chat for the panelists. So please write your questions in the chat, and then I will be able to open your audio and video if you like. Some of the questions on YouTube already, or comments, are what you've touched upon already, but if anybody feels like adding to it, it's a question coming from Miguel Felipe, and he says, hello, thank you. This question is addressed to all the speakers. What are the differences between Bourdieu's scientific and public engagement and other initiatives such as public sociology? maybe Frédéric, with sociologists of the world without borders, has something to add.
Difficult question, I think. But I think Bourdieu puts the stress on the specificity of fields, which is not that present in the conception of public sociology as it has developed. I think it's not exactly the same line, I would say. I would say Bourdieu's line is more attentive to, more conscious of the issues related to autonomy and lack of autonomy of fields and their interdependencies. I would say that. And he also would argue that there is a specific sphere of scientific accumulation that is very important, that there are translation issues, that there are issues of getting out of one's field into another one and things like that, which are not that present in the classical way public sociology has been diffused in sociological associations and so on, in journals. There is, of course, an affinity, but it's different, I would say that.
Thank you, Frédéric. Okay, so we have a question in the chat in French. I'll read it in French and then I'll translate. I promise we won't be long since we already started late and it's getting late for everyone. Bonjour, j'avais une question concernant les relations entre le champ intellectuel, le champ scientifique et le champ académique. Dans le dictionnaire Bourdieu, Gisèle Sapiro et Frédéric Lebaron ont rédigé plusieurs articles. Sorry, I lost it. Ont rédigé plusieurs articles. I'll open it on the screen. Here it is. So, stimulant sur les différents champs, et vous distinguez bien, par exemple, le champ académique et le champ scientifique, mais j'ai en revanche du mal à concevoir la distinction avec le champ intellectuel, car Bourdieu emploie souvent indifféremment le concept de champ intellectuel ou celui du champ scientifique. Peut-on considérer, par exemple, que lorsqu'il publie un article comme Révolution dans la Révolution, en 1961, dans la revue Esprit, il s'agit d'une production dans le champ intellectuel, et lorsqu'il publie un article comme Célibat et conditions paysannes, il s'agit d'une production dans le champ scientifique. So let me just quickly translate. This question refers to the differences and the relationships between the intellectual field, the scientific field, and the academic field. And the person asking the question is Victor Collard, and he refers to Dictionnaire International Bourdieu by Gisèle Sapiro. And he refers in particular to multiple entries by Frederick Lebaron and Gisèle Sapiro, considering the different fields and the way of distinguishing among them. So he gives an example that the academic and the scientific field sometimes pose a difficulty to distinguish between them. That the two of them pose a difficulty, so that the academic and scientific are difficult to distinguish in comparison with the intellectual field, because Bourdieu often uses them without a specific difference or kind of intermittently. The concept of the intellectual field and the concept of the scientific field. So Victor Collard proposes also an answer by saying, could we consider, for example, that when Bourdieu publishes an article like Revolution Within Revolution in 1961 in Esprit, that it's in the domain of the intellectual field that we're talking about, and then when he publishes something as Celibacy and Conditions Paysannes, and the condition of villager, if somebody correct me please for my translation, we're talking about the scientific field.
I can start, and if Frédéric wants to go on. Is that okay?
Please do.
Yeah, so it's a very relevant question, because indeed scientific and academic field is quite different, because academia imply the institution of higher education, but also the research institutes, and the scientific field is more the specific competition around science, and Frédéric can better define the distinction than I will, but I think the concept of intellectual field in Bourdieu is not very precisely defined. There is a large concept of it, which is the one that Christophe Charles develops in his article, which appears in the 1966 paper, his first paper, which he afterwards rejected because he thought it was too interactionist, but still there you have a kind of beginning of field theory. But in this concept of intellectual field, he embraces literature and all the other intellectual spheres, and it's not specifically related to intellectuals, public intellectuals. But there are some places where he has a more restricted approach, and then indeed journals, specific intellectual journals like the ones that Anna Boschetti studies about around competing with Les Temps Modernes after the Second World War, constitute a kind of intellectual field where there is a specific competition about imposing a worldview. I would define it this way, imposing the legitimate worldview, and it is part of the broader field of the ideological production, which Bourdieu defines in distinction. In this field of ideological production, I would include all the unions, all the NGOs, or other, of course, not only the more restricted political field, but all the movements, social movements, associations who fight around defining the legitimate worldview. But within this space, I would say that the intellectual field, there is a specific competition among intellectuals for the legitimate worldview. And in this case, I would totally agree with the idea that when he publishes this paper, in Esprit, he's acting more in the intellectual field, and while in Célibat et Conditions Paysannes, though one of them is in Temps Moderne, and so the border is not very clear, because Temps Moderne would publish also, and also Esprit, academic production, but that would have a more impact on current issues and a more political connotations, I would say. But maybe Frédéric has a different view.
Oh, no, I agree with you. The only thing I could add is that probably the intellectual field emerges at the intersection between what you call the field of ideological production and the scientific field. The question is, why does it emerge? And it refers to the birth of the intellectuals, to the work by Charles and Affaire Dreyfus. That is, they commit, they go outside their field. They may come from the literary field as well, of course, not only the scientific, obviously. But I think that's important to think in analytical terms, and to try to sometimes correct or add new formulation, because Bourdieu, of course, and it's his way of creating. As a scientific creator, he innovated all the time, and his concepts are not always completely stabilized. So we have to discuss with them and try to refine them in some ways or adapt them to. But I think here to refer to this historical emergence of the intellectual field may give a part of the answer. As you say, Gisèle, I agree. I totally agree. And including the distinction between intellectual journals, which is very specific for France, and scientific or literary field.
You have, for instance, also the New Let Review at the time, and some others. It's not only in France that you have such journals, I would say. And also there's been recently an exhibit about intellectual journals in the third world, and it was fascinating, the circulation of the model of commitment, of intellectual commitments. They were everywhere. It's very, very interesting, in the 1950s, 1960s. It's really fascinating. Maybe I could just add one thing, is that the Dreyfus Affair, I think Christophe Charles defines that very well, that the Dreyfus Affair, when the petition was signed by, the Dreyfus Affair is connected with the figure of Zola, but the petition was signed by scientists, lawyers, professors, university professors. And so it was constituting this intellectual, this figure of the public intellectual at the time by the very signature. And one of the bodies that was born at the time is the Ligue des Droits de l'Homme, which is the first probably collective intellectual that we can identify.
In which Durkheim was very much involved.
Thank you, Gisèle and Frédéric. Would anybody like to add something? Victor Collard is thanking you for very precise answers. Franck and Philip, anything you would like to add? All right. Well, just to thank you again very much. And in line of what you were saying, I think whether we're talking about the Affaire Dreyfus or Sartre at the time, it's the stepping out of the hearing the call as the call addressed to yourself and not someone else that probably creates the engagement towards the other. A bit of a philosophical conclusion from the intruder amongst you, since I'm a philosopher.